The great social experiment in the military during the Civil War was the recruitment and training of black soldiers. But it was a medical question as well. Would they fight? Would they stand up to the rigors of the march and combat? Hi, I'm Robert Hicks, Director of the Mütter Museum and Historical Medical Library of the College of Physicians of Philadelphia. And welcome to another episode of Broken Bodies, Suffering Spirits, Injury, Death, and Healing in Civil War Philadelphia. We are just outside Philadelphia to the north in what is now Cheltenham Township. And during the Civil War, this was mostly farmland. It was called Chelten Hills. The village of Lamont was nearby. And I am standing at the only surviving structure of Camp William Penn. Camp William Penn was the only training camp established exclusively for preparing African American soldiers for combat. Freedmen and slaves from the South gravitated to this and other camps in the North where they could be recruited and trained. This one was particularly in the spotlight because of its exclusivity. In fact, on weekends, citizens from Philadelphia would come out on trolleys in order to watch the troops drill and train here. The camp commandant, Louis Wagner, was himself a leader of another Pennsylvania regiment and had been wounded. He had experienced battlefield medicine firsthand, and in fact, he was still partially disabled when he was camp commandant here. When these units were formed, it was white officers who were appointed to command them. There was even a special school in Philadelphia to prepare white officers to command black troops. But soldiers are soldiers. They must have good health, they must maintain nutrition, and they have special medical needs. And the health of the African American soldier was an interesting experiment during the Civil War. Now, the regiments of United States colored troops were set up the way regiments of white troops were set up. Same administrative structure. Now, the black troops, of course, had white officers. They were the only ones around with military or combat experience. But it also meant that regimental surgeons, which is what physicians were called in the Army, were also white. And for some of them, many of them, it was the first occasion in their careers when they would administer medicine to a black body. And there were still a lot of open questions. Are black bodies the same as white bodies? Do they function the same way, and do they behave the same way when they're around infectious diseases? Well, consider that a lot of the African American men coming to these training camps were either slaves or they were freedmen. Slaves had lived in isolated rural areas, and they're coming into mixed populations for the first time where they do not have immunity to some of the common diseases and ailments of people who live in urban areas. This particularly became a problem in the winter of 1863 to 1864 when there were massive problems with measles with black soldiers. And there were various pockets of other health problems throughout the war. But senior military planners thought that colored troops should be sent into the Deep South, where there are tropical diseases and high humidity summers. It was thought that the African American soldier would be more resistant to tropical diseases by virtue of having worked as slaves. So this did affect military planning, and it was found very quickly, of course, that black soldiers can get sick just as white soldiers, and they need the same nutrition, they need the same sleep, they need to maintain health. And it is a primary responsibility of a regimental surgeon to maintain good fighting order, which means good health of the troops. Didn't always happen in all the black regiments, and sometimes the quality of medical care was not quite as good as it was in the white regiments. And the same goes for the food that was available to those troops.
When the Emancipation came out, apparently there was this giant transparency that was put up at Chestnut Street proclaiming the Emancipation. Okay, this is from our collection of the Abraham Barker collection on the Free Military School for the Command of Colored Regiments. And what the Free Military School was it was formed after the Emancipation Proclamation went out, and Abraham Lincoln said it's time to raise regiments of colored troops to fight in the war.
My name is William Atkinson. I am the adjutant for the 38th United States Colored Troops, and we formed in Norfolk, Virginia. Most of these men were from Virginia and North Carolina. Matter of fact, a good number of them were actually from the Richmond-Chesterfield County area. And these were all men that were a mix of freedmen, some were escaped slaves, but actually the majority were freedmen from that northern North Carolina, southern Virginia area. Well, to be very honest with you, I would serve with nobody else but black troops right now. I have served in very good white units, but these men are fighting for a cause. They are fighting for their own freedom, their very own families. And I think that they have much more to lose than any white soldier out there. So therefore, I feel, and I care what no other officer says, I think these men will be some of the finest fighting men in the world.
Tom, tell me about the kind of men who were recruited in and trained at Camp William Penn, particularly what you looked for general health.
Well, general health was basically a deep knee bend, and see that they had their two front teeth. Deep knee bend indicated some amount of flexibility on their part. Many of these men were farmers, watermen, fishermen, mostly slave, not that many were free by comparison, a number of them from Pennsylvania. Do they have their two front teeth? Obviously, so they can rip off a cartridge to load a weapon. And do a deep knee bend. That means they have some degree of flexibility.
Well, this is another wonderful story that not only pertains to African Americans, but to all the soldiers. Those who came from the cities had already been in crowded conditions with bad water, so they'd been through a number of those problematic systems. As children, they had dysentery and outgrew it. Whereas many of the men who came from the countryside with fresh air and smaller populations had never been exposed to these kinds of diseases. So, as a result, the guys who came from the clean air and clean environment took higher casualties because of disease than those who came from the urban centers who had lived through those kinds of things. So once again, we find that very, very high numbers of the rural soldiers, those with what's getting clean air, many of them who actually had been enslaved, took much higher casualties based on disease than those who get shot by guns and or die from bullets. The smallpox vaccinations, of course, and are concerned about it, go all the way back to the American Revolution. So even the famous story about Ben Franklin, who was saying, well, I'm not going to get my son inoculated in that fashion that those Africans use. He thought it was just stupid and it would never work. And of course, Franklin's son, Francis Folger, died when he was 4 years old, because he did not get inoculated. So by the time the Revolution, Franklin was on board with inoculations, Washington was on board with inoculations, and of course by the time of the Civil War, the entire Union Army was on board with inoculations. Certainly there were some men who died from those inoculations, but they'd find somebody with the pox, they'd take a needle and a thread, rub it through that pox, and then sew it into the next person's hand, just enough to get that infection inside, and that smaller infection would protect them against larger and bigger and greater infections. So inoculations, even though it did lose 1 or 2 out of 100 or so, was a very effective method for the Union Army.
We do have artifacts in here that are from the U.S. colored troops. And they really would be because we donate and offer the USCTs, which we call them U.S. colored troops. This third USCTs has a permanent display in this building, and they're in here regularly changing that display, bringing in items not only of uniforms and items and accoutrements that the soldiers had, but it's amazing when we have in February when they bring items in for Black History Month, they have authenticated slave chains and other things that people really come to see. So yeah, we have, quite regularly we offer that kind of information and artifacts.